The UConn men have 5 national championships now, and that's fucking crazy. They beat San Diego State last night. Not super locked into college basketball during the regular season anymore like I used to be. But watching the tournament, watching UConn play, you're like, man, they've got like 7 or 8 guys that are all really good. Watching anybody try to go at Sanogo was hysterical. It's like trying to post up a brick wall. San Diego State's an older team. They're tough. The comeback during the Final Four was incredible, but the limitation they have as far as shot creators, like it just kind of played out. They were lucky to only be down 12 at the half, I thought, where UConn kind of got a little weird at the end of it. It felt a little bit like the women's national final where you're like, okay, this is a really good story out of Iowa, but LSU is clearly the better basketball team. And that's what it felt like last night. So they feel like they were the right team to win this whole thing. And now they have 5 championships back in Storrs, Connecticut. I've shared this history before. I'll do it again because I think I have some pretty good perspective on this. My first sports memories ever, walking up the tunnel at Fenway Park and seeing that huge green monster out there and going, what is this? Sensory overload everywhere. Falling in love with Fenway, falling in love with Yaz, falling in love with peanut vendors and just all of it. You know, just being a little kid, going to a baseball game with your dad. Hard to be more American than that, right? So the other one was the Philadelphia 76ers. The Sixers are going for 70. Sports Illustrated cover, the 82-83 team that won an NBA title. That team was incredible. One of the all-time greatest teams in NBA history. It's just they didn't have back-to-back titles, so they get forgotten. And it was just cooler. Dr. J was cooler than anything the Celtics were offering at the time as a little kid. It drove my father fucking crazy, but that's where it all kind of started. Moses, Mo Cheeks, Andrew Toney, Bobby Jones. I loved that team. And then the other thing is the Big East, going to UConn games. My father played a little college basketball, so, you know, he just was still always super into basketball. I was going to grow up being into basketball because he was, but I also loved it too. But you have to understand, we went to those UConn games to watch the other teams. And for me, usually root against UConn. It's where I fell in love with St. John's. We had ties to Providence. My father's side of the family is all from Providence. My uncle was involved in Providence basketball. My family on my dad's side, they were really close to the Mulaney's. So there was just all of these Providence ties that we had where if PC came in, we were rooting for Providence. When St. John's came in, rooted for St. John's. You know, Georgetown was the coolest thing. It was just unlike anything else. If you were a little kid, you're like, this is awesome. But again, I like St. John's, so it wasn't like I was going to root for Syracuse or Georgetown. I remember one year Georgetown showed up in like sailor suits in the layup line. And you're like, these dudes, and I think it was like a cursive like script where it said G-Town on like the little sailor flap in the back. And they just had a style and a vibe about them that was different than anything else. I remember, you know, back then it was called the Civic Center. And it was a joke. Like, people made fun of it. People can get nostalgic about the mall and where the Whalers played, and you'd walk around and be Chucks. I think they had a Margaritaville in there. I remember a lot of nights, if there was this guy that my dad was friends with where we go to UConn games, that guy would always like want to go into the bar after, and I'd fucking sit in the lobby for like an hour and a half just waiting, which again doesn't sound super safe when you're like 8 or 9 years old, but that's what was happening. My father didn't drink, but it was like, okay. And now looking back on it, I'm like, God, that sucked. Why would you do that? And then I would just walk into the bar being like, hey, bro, I'm fucking exhausted. I'm like 9. Can we go home? I got school tomorrow. So, you know, there were all these memories and how many times I would spend, all these hours I would spend inside that building. And then funny enough, when I moved to Hartford, when I was at ESPN, I moved into the building that was connected to it. My father's like, it's pretty funny. All the years we went to those games in the Civic Center. Then it was the XL Center. And it wasn't the mall anymore. And it's just a town that's, you know, it's a tough sell. Hartford's a tough sell for anybody that's spending any time there. And you would just watch them lose. Like, that was the point, is you would never show up like thinking it was cool. Now, yes, if you're from Connecticut, if you're from the area, you have some ties to UConn, you'd be rooting for that team, but it wasn't fun. Don Perno was the head coach the 4 years that I was paying attention to it in the beginning. And the whole point was like, they're not any good. They won 19 games in the Big East total in the last 4 years he was there. So the point of it all was that you would go to like watch UConn lose and then hope the other team had awesome players. And really back then in the Big East, that other team always had awesome players. It was Earl Kelly was the guy for UConn. Like, he was like the one guy that was talented enough to hang with some of the other better players coming from Q's. You know, Villanova was always stacked too. The attraction was who was coming in to beat UConn. So if you were to ever sit there going, hey, this program will become one of the elite programs in the sport, it wouldn't, I mean, forget getting drug tested or laughed at or all this stuff. Like, it would be so fucking dumb. A guy would be like, don't tweet that. Again, we didn't have that option back then because it was an impossibility. Then Jim Calhoun shows up in 87 and they win the NIT immediately. He wins 4 Big East titles. When they won the Big East title in 1990, it was like, wait, are they good? And then in 1990, they lose in the Elite Eight. I was at the Buckland Mall watching that game, and I'm just kind of thinking like, wait, UConn's good? And you felt like you wanted to root for them. But again, I was a St. John's fan, so I wasn't going to be like a fraud about it. But it was just this like, novelty's not fair because it's the Elite Eight. They win, one of the best conference tournaments in college basketball. And you're like, well, how is this happening? And it's because of Calhoun. But even as great as Calhoun was, he didn't get his first title until 1999. That was his 13th season at Storrs. But that's where this whole thing started. And that's why when you look up and see UCLA with their 11 titles, 10 of them between 64 and 75, Kentucky with their 8 titles, only one since UConn's run. North Carolina's got a couple more recent ones. They have 6, but then UConn, Duke, and Indiana all have 5. UConn has more than fucking Kansas. Like, what? Kansas? And if you've been to Storrs, you don't even notice it. The campus is nice. I don't want people to get defensive about this, but if you're driving down the highway, you don't even notice the campus. You notice the sign on the highway, which will have to be updated now between the men's and women's total titles. There's also a huge billboard for this weird strip club no one ever went to. And if you're recruiting somebody to Storrs, you have the history, which is clearly how this works. And Danny Hurley looks like he's absolutely the right guy. But it's like, all right, it's a little quiet. We're here in Storrs. And then if you don't want to be in Storrs for the night as a kid, and again, don't forget that element of this. But if we don't want to be in Storrs, we can go to Hartford. The natural recruiting base, which I pointed out last night, there's the proximity to New York and New Jersey and that kind of stuff. Sure. And like, look, if it's about proximity, then St. John should be a better basketball team. But it's still a lot of like, hey, this guy's at this prep school, and they keep getting all of these dudes to show up there because it's not Duke. It's not UCLA. It's not Kentucky. It's not all of these other things. You could argue if you've been to Bloomington, which feels like it's in the middle of nowhere. I've been there, but Indiana is basketball. All right. Indiana is basketball way more than anybody would think so with Connecticut. And you also have other places that are just better destinations scattered around the entire state. And they keep getting it done. I was trying to think of some kind of analogy for this. I mean, hell, UConn left the Big East for 7 years and they were in the AAC, and then they come back and they win this year's title. If you were to say, okay, what's happening now somewhere else in another program where you go, okay, this is the equivalent of this. So like the first thought was, what if Vandy won 5 national championships in football? Like, I can't even say it out loud without laughing. Now, the other thing, too, is that Vandy's at least in Nashville. So you've got that all over Storrs. And even though that's never going to happen because there's too many other programs in the SEC that are taking football more seriously than Vandy does, and the admissions part of it and all those other things. But at least from a pure recruiting standpoint of being a destination and also having more football players in the South, you could make an argument that it would actually maybe make more sense than UConn winning 5 titles. Mississippi was another one. What if Mississippi State won 5 national championships in football? Starkville's not my number one SEC destination, but it's still a state in Mississippi where the most recent thing I looked at, they have 63 NFL players. 63 NFL players. So if you did a straight correlation of how many guys who were born in Connecticut or from Connecticut, high school in Connecticut, again, if you include the prep schools, it's a little bit more, but it's not like Connecticut's some NBA hotbed, even though it's proximity to New York City. You should be able to get them a few guys, or New York State as well. I was kind of thinking about this. Maybe this would be the best one. What if Oregon State won 5 national championships? I've been to Corvallis. If you live in Corvallis, like, you kind of get what I'm saying, right? But even Corvallis is kind of more of, it is more of a destination on your way to maybe something else, driving around Oregon on your way to Portland, than it would be for you to somehow find yourself in Storrs, Connecticut. And that's kind of the whole point of this run, is it's one thing to win all these titles. And when you look at this program, if you're an AD somewhere else that's never had any success in a couple of the sports that really matter, you could look at UConn and say, hey, that's the model. But if you were to ever say that to anybody sitting there through those games in the early to mid 80s and going, I could see this becoming one of the main powerhouses in college basketball, you'd get laughed at then the same way you get laughed at today is trying to use UConn as a model.